Hi everyone, Erin here. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of the experimental research strategy. We'll be talking about what is a confound and how do we control for it. So in the last video, we talked about how we could explore the relationship between music and math by conducting an experiment where we assign participants to either receive music training or a control art training, and we look to see if there's differences in their math scores at the end of this training, all the while controlling for other third variables to ensure that they're not a confound in our design. So this raises the question of what exactly is a confound and how does it differ from any other extraneous or third variable? Well, that is a great question. A confound is a special kind of third variable that has the potential to influence the dependent variable, and also it varies systematically with the independent variable. So if we take our example from before, math is our dependent variable. So anything that could impact math abilities could have the potential to be a confound. So the age of the participants, their IQ, for example, but probably not their eye color or their shoe size. A confound also has to vary systematically with the independent variable, and this is what we have to watch out for. So anytime there's a systematic difference between participants in one group compared to the other, this could be a confound. So take this example of age being a confound. Imagine that it happened to be that all of the participants or most of the participants in our music group were older than those in the art group. And then we measured their math skills and we found that those in the music group had higher math skills than those in the art group. Well, we wouldn't know if that higher math ability was because of the training that they received or the fact that the participants were older. So this would be a problem and something we would want to avoid. This is a threat to internal validity that arises from a certain kind of experimenter bias called assignment bias, where the process used to assign participants to groups or to conditions and produces groups of participants with noticeably different characteristics. So this is obviously something that we want to avoid whenever we're designing an experiment, and to some extent, a quasi-experiment as well. A study with high internal validity is going to do the best that it can to control for all possible confounding variables. Confounding variables can come from the participants themselves, characteristics of the participants that could be different in one group than the other. So for example, if participants in one group are older, smarter, wiser than participants in the other, this could be a problem. It can come from the environment. So let's say all of the kids in the music group, when we go to test their math skills, we test them in a brightly lit room with aromatherapy and soft, wonderful music playing. Whereas when we test the math skills in the music group, it's in a dark, dank, stinky room, and the experimenter is cracking a whip at them. Obviously, this would be a difference and this would be a problem. Confounding can also come from time. So if the amount of time that participants have their training for music or art is different, the amount of experience that participants gain in both groups is different. So the amount in addition to what the experiment experience is. Also, we have to think about the time of testing. So if we tested all of the music kids on a Saturday in the middle of summer vacation versus we tested all of the art kids after a long day of school during exam break, well, obviously this could be a problem. So our solution is that we really want to create equivalent groups. The separate groups should be composed of equivalent individuals that are created equally and treated equally. In an experiment, we really can ensure this because remember, in an experiment, the examiner is manipulating the independent variable. They're assigning participants to the groups, and so they have full control over who is going into which group. And so steps can be taken to ensure that the groups are equivalent in terms of those other third variables so that they're not a confound. In quasi-experiments, it's a little bit more tricky because we're comparing groups that already exist in the real world. So these are pre-existing groups. But a good high-quality experiment, quasi-experiment, would think about who are we recruiting to be participants in our two groups and try to ensure that the groups are equivalent as much as possible. You really want to think about this for your research proposal. Both when you're writing your research proposal, you're going to want to think about what are potential confounding variables in your study and how you're going to control for them. This is going to be really important and something we'll be looking for. And you also want to be looking for it when you read research studies, both in this course and moving forward. You want to read the method section, look to see who are the groups comprised of, and can we feel confident that the groups are equivalent in all the other variables that we don't care about. Remember, to be confident that it's the independent variable that's causing a difference or a change in the dependent variable, the groups or conditions, those levels of the independent variable, should only differ in terms of the independent variable. They should be the same in terms of all other variables that we're not interested in. This is what we mean by saying that a study has high internal validity, where we've isolated just the variables that we're interested in studying so that we can ensure that other variables don't provide an alternative and equally likely explanation for the results. So how can we control for extraneous variables? Well, we're going to talk about 3 ways now. Holding variables constant, also called limiting the range, matching variables across treatment conditions, and randomization. So I'm going to give you an example of what these look like. So imagine we were actually doing this experiment and we've assigned kids to receive either music or art and we're comparing their math scores, but we have this assignment bias problem where we have accidentally created 2 groups that are unequal in terms of the number of girls and boys in each group. So you can see here, this is a problem. In the music group, we've got relatively more girls, and in the art group, we've got relatively more boys. And this is a problem because we've got the systematic difference between groups, and there is evidence to suggest that gender could impact our dependent variable. Particularly if we're measuring spatial skills, boys on average tend to be better in tasks that require them to identify spatial patterns than girls. And if that's how we're measuring math, then this could be a problem. If you're interested in gender or sex differences in math abilities, check out the references. I've given the whole reference in the notes section at the bottom of this slide. So we want to avoid the situation where we've got a confound with gender. So what we could do is hold gender constant. So that means we would just recruit participants that are at one level of that gender variable. So we could either recruit girls or just recruit boys. All of our participants in this case would be girls. So now we don't have a systematic difference between conditions. So this would increase our internal validity. Another option, which is probably a better way of controlling for gender, would be to match our groups in terms of gender. So that means we've got an equal number of boys and girls in each group, so we don't have a systematic difference. This is great. Increase our internal validity. Finally, another option would be to use a random process to assign participants to groups. So we'd want 30 participants in music, 30 in art, and so we'd recruit 60 altogether, and we would just flip a coin to determine which individual participant goes into each group, and so we'd leave it up to chance to determine who goes into which group. So this would, to some extent, also increase our internal validity. So we've got these 3 methods. In practice, we often end up doing a combination of all 3 to control for multiple extraneous variables at the same time. And I'll show you what I mean. So if we come back to the situation of gender, which we have previous research to suggest that it's going to impact our dependent variable, we probably don't want to leave it just to chance to ensure our groups are equivalent in this. So we probably wouldn't want to use the randomization process. If we compare holding constant and matching, both of these methods will increase the internal validity of our study because we avoid gender being a confound, but holding gender constant comes at a cost to our external validity, where if you remember, external validity is all about whether the people, the context, the testing situation, the time period that was done in this study also is similar enough that to other situations that the results from our study can generalize to those other situations. If we only test girls, our study will be able to speak to the relationship between music and math abilities in girls, but we won't know if a similar pattern will also be seen in boys. And this is a problem because our results will only apply to 50% of the population. So the downside of holding constant is that it decreases our external validity. So we would probably want to use a matching process to control for gender. Okay, so we're going to match groups in terms of gender. Let's use another example of another variable that we might want to control for to talk about when we might want to use the holding constant technique. Let's think about age of participants. Imagine we did this study and we recruited kids from preschool all the way up through high school. And we happen to be the case that we've got this unequal mixture of younger kids and older kids. So obviously that would be a problem here. Again, given we know that math is going to impact or be impacted by the age of the participants, so older kids are obviously going to be better at a math test than younger kids are. Again, we're not going to want to rely on the randomization technique to control for age. So that's out too. Let's look at the matching technique. So in the matching technique, we're going to have an equal number of early elementary school and late high school students in our group. So we're avoiding it being a confound, but this introduces another problem. We're going to talk about this problem in more detail in future videos, and you can read about it in chapter 8. But just briefly, the problem that we have here is because age, we know, is going to have a huge impact on our dependent variable. For sure, a 6-year-old is going to be, the way they think about math is going to be very different than a 15-year-old. We're probably going to have to use a totally different test to measure their math skills. If we have a mixture of younger kids and older kids in both of our groups, it's going to create a lot of variability within each group in terms of their math skills, and it's going to make it really hard for us to see if there's a significant difference between kids based on whether they get the music or the art training. So matching can, although it increases the internal validity of our study, can make it more difficult for us to find a true difference between groups, even if that difference exists, because we are introducing a lot more variability into our study. So probably what we would want to do for the age variable is to hold age constant. We would say, okay, we're just going to test a smaller age range of kids, so maybe only early elementary school or maybe only high school students. And our study will speak to the relationship between music and math skills in this age group. So we're going to only recruit a limited age range of kids. We're going to have our 60 participants so that we can have 30 in our music group, 30 in our art group. We're going to ensure that we're recruiting an equal number of girls and boys. So we're going to have 30 girls, 30 boys, and we're going to use the matching technique to ensure we've got 15 girls and 15 boys in each group. And then in order to determine which of those 15 individuals are going to get which of the training programs, we're going to flip a coin. This is the randomization technique. The randomization technique will allow us to control for all other variables that could also impact our dependent variable, our math skills. So how much sleep the kids have, how much they like math, how much they like art or music, all of the other, what they ate for breakfast that day, all of the other possible things that could impact the dependent variable. We're letting chance avoid a systematic bias in terms of who's going into which group. So you can see how we can use multiple methods to control for multiple variables at the same time. All experiments involve this randomization to some extent, and this is why, particularly in medical research, true experiments are also called randomized control trials. So how do you decide which method to use? The answer is it's up to you as the researcher to decide and to justify which is the best method to control for particular extraneous variables in order for you to best address your research question. You can look to previous studies to look to see what they did and try to decide if that makes sense for your study as well. So if we compare those three methods, holding constant and matching is probably the best method to use to ensure a particular variable is not a confound. But the downside is that it requires extra effort and an extra level of measurement. And you really have to weigh the pros and cons of the holding constant technique, which is going to decrease your external validity, versus the matching technique, which is going to introduce more variability into your study and make it harder for you to see a true difference between conditions. Randomization is always used to some extent in true experiments because it controls for a wide variety of variables simultaneously. The downside is that it relies on chance, and so there's no absolute guarantee that we're going to be successful in balancing a particular variable. And so this technique is probably not best if you have reason to think that that particular variable is important to control for. Finally, another method, which we're going to talk about in much more detail towards the end of the course, and which you could read about now if you're interested in chapter 11, is to include the extraneous variable as a factor in your experiment. So if you recruit 120 participants, then we could have and you could have 60 are young kids and 60 are old kids. Of them, half of them would be girls and half would be boys, and half would get music and half would get art. If you do this, then you could explore not only the relationship between music and math scores, but you could also ask whether that relationship is the same or different depending on how old the kids are. So stay tuned, we'll be talking more about this in the future. So to summarize, extraneous variables can become confounds when they impact the dependent variable and they vary systematically with the independent variable. We can avoid the systematic varying with the independent variable by controlling for the confounds, by holding a variable constant, matching across conditions, and randomization. All of these methods increase the, fill in the blank here, internal validity of our study. In the next few videos and the next few chapters, we're going to be talking about different ways that we can do experiments. We'll be talking about between subjects and within subjects design. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much.